There was a time when no one had known where the first Star Wars was going. From the big reveals in Empire to the final showdown in Jedi, this is what it was really like to see the original trilogy in theaters, Ewoks and all.
On May 25, 1977, a pop culture phenomenon was born. After months of hype, a movie called Star Wars hit theaters. While it took a week or two for Star Wars fever to fully catch on nationwide, it was an overnight sensation in California. The film premiered at Grauman's Chinese Theater in Hollywood, where it became completely normal to see lines of fans camped outside the movie house. Actress Carrie Fisher told Time magazine, "It wasn't like a movie opening, it was like an earthquake." The Chinese theater was at the epicenter of that earthquake, and thousands of fans were drawn to it every day. Speaking to CNN, Star Wars fan Chris Baldock recalled traveling from the San Fernando Valley to Hollywood to see the movie on May 26th, just one day after the film opened. The long line wound down the street from Grauman's Chinese Theater and around the block. News helicopters hovered in the air above the crowd. Star Wars was the first film to earn a reputation as a party movie. The fans brought costumes, beach balls, folding chairs for the line, and an almost palatable anticipation. There was no better place to see it than Grauman's Chinese in its pre-multiplex days. On advice from 20th Century Fox, the owners of the famous theater only booked Star Wars for a 2-week run. When a scheduling conflict meant they couldn't show the hit film after that, they resorted to desperate measures and refurbished an old cinema. Larry Gleason, former president of Mann Theaters, told The Hollywood Reporter, "We moved Star Wars there, where it played for 2 weeks before coming back to the Chinese." Star Wars toys would explode in popularity over the next couple years, but back when the film was first released, the toys weren't ready and all kids had was the movie itself. George Lucas's film became so popular with youngsters that some of them were even ditching school so they could see it. A lifelong fan, Patrick Payne, told StarWars.com, "Unless you lived through it and can remember, it's kind of hard for modern audiences to understand just how different the world was in 1977, just prior to the release of Star Wars. I had seen the trailers on TV and in the theater months earlier. They didn't say much. However, what little they showed had already triggered my imagination." Payne sought out the novelization of Star Wars, which had hit the shelves in November 1976. After reading the book, he knew that he absolutely had to see the story play out on the big screen. Payne recalled that a little thing like class wasn't going to stand in his way. "I, for one, was not going to miss this movie, even if I had to miss school. Therefore, I skipped school. Sorry, parents," took the bus downtown, and saw the very first show on opening day. Another young film enthusiast who saw the film on opening day was Brad Bird, who would later direct such hit films as Ratatouille and The Incredibles. He described to CNN what happened in the theater when Darth Vader appeared on screen for the first time.
And the audience simultaneously boos and hisses like it's a silent movie.
In the mid to late 1970s, there weren't a lot of movies with broad, cross-generational appeal being released, which is another reason why Star Wars did so well. Speaking to the official Star Wars website on the 40th anniversary of the film's release, artist Paul Bateman revealed that his father wasn't really interested in seeing a space movie at first, but he ended up having the time of his life. Bateman fondly recalled, "When we arrived at the theater, the line to buy tickets was around the block, and Dad was bored waiting in the line. However, not too long after the opening scenes, my dad became just as engrossed in the film as I was. He was cheering and reacting along with every adult and child in the audience." California native Fred White had just turned 8 years old when Star Wars came out, and despite knowing absolutely nothing about the film, he was hugely excited when his father told him they were going to see it. White reminisced about that day to CNN. He said, "It's called Star Wars. I clearly remember thinking, Star Wars, that's a weird name. We saw it that day, and I never thought it sounded weird again." Like so many kids his age, Star Wars became a huge part of White's childhood, and he has shared a special bond with his dad since that day. They even started a Star Wars tradition and went to the opening day of the next 2 films together. One of the reasons Star Wars managed to stay in theaters for so long was because people were returning for repeat viewings. There was even a healthy competition breaking out among the fledgling fandom. When the topic came up on Reddit, one user recalled seeing Star Wars over a dozen times. The Redditor wrote, "It was absolutely the coolest thing ever. Saw that sucker 14 times that summer. First movie I ever went to see more than once."
What do you want to do tonight? Oh, and if you say see Star Wars again, I'm leaving. You don't want to leave.
Another Reddit user recalled seeing it at least once a week for the entire summer after getting his initially reluctant friends hooked on the film. When it finally made it to the discount theater, we went as groups every weekend through year's end. Of course, going to see a movie isn't free. It's all well and good when you're an adult with a job to support your new Star Wars obsession, but how did kids in the 1970s manage to see the film so many times? Well, 13-year-old Russell Burgess and his friend Scott maximized their budget by getting 3 showings for the price of 1. He admitted to CNN, "We rode our bikes 7 miles to the biggest cinema in our area, waited in line 3 hours, and then sat through 3 viewings in a row, hiding behind the screen curtains and in the emergency exit stairwells while the theater was cleaned between shows." In a passionate Medium article, Star Wars fan Rob Connery said that seeing the movie in theaters at age 9 was a life-altering experience for him, reminding younger film fans just how unique it was at the time. According to Connery, it wasn't just the visual effects that made Star Wars unlike anything people had seen before, it was the whole package. He wrote, "Most movies you would go see as a kid were kind of crappy. I remember really liking Escape to Witch Mountain and Herbie movies, but as I grew older, I wanted something more adventure and, yes, a little bit of suspense and scariness too. We just didn't have that back then. It was all goofy Disney dreck." That all changed when Star Wars came along. According to Connery, it was the perfect escape activity for the pre-internet age, when kids didn't have endless entertainment at their fingertips. Connery added, "There was absolutely nothing like Star Wars when it came out. I'm struggling to come up with some relevant analogy for movies today, something that makes you jump up and scream, that alters your life profoundly and makes you believe in space travel, exotic alien planets, and the Force." Much like Connery, fans from around the globe had their eyes and minds opened to endless possibilities by this film.
You've taken your first step into a larger world.
Patty Hammond, creator of the Everyday Fangirl blog, won tickets to see Star Wars from a local TV station. The trouble was the theater was a 40-mile round-trip journey from her family home. Hammond wrote about the experience for StarWars.com. Back then, the freeway system was not what it is today, and a trip to the theater took over an hour. However, with Dad being a big science fiction fan, we decided to do it. Lucas's space opera more than lived up to her and her father's expectations. Hammond elaborated. "When we came out of the theater, he said, 'Mark my words, this movie will become a classic.' Boy, did he predict that one." Of course, back then, it wasn't uncommon to drive to a movie and see it without ever having to leave your vehicle. Star Wars played as a double feature with Smokey and the Bandit at a number of drive-in theaters, including one in Kansas, where CNET's Bonnie Burton was watching in awe from the back of a pickup truck. Burton remembers with wonder the experience of seeing Star Wars outdoors. "I can't adequately express the fun of watching Skywalker blow up the Death Star on a big screen beneath a sky full of twinkly stars. As an imaginative kid, it was hard to see where the Star Wars galaxy ended and our own night sky began. After that experience, I'd stare up at the sky throughout my childhood, hoping to see the Millennium Falcon zip by Earth on its way to Coruscant." One of the reasons that Star Wars got such an enthusiastic welcome in 1977 is because there wasn't a whole lot of joy at the time. George Lucas's debut feature, THX 1138, was a dark, gritty sci-fi experience, but he grew up adoring characters like Flash Gordon and wanted to capture that type of magic with an uplifting tale of good versus evil. Lucas's vision apparently didn't go down well among veteran sci-fi writers who didn't want to see the genre watered down for younger viewers. August Rigoni, who saw the movie on opening day, told Tested they hated that Star Wars legitimized sci-fi. But at the time, we needed Star Wars. We had a recession, we had an energy crisis, and we needed some serious escapism. It was the perfect adventure movie for a kid and the kid in everyone. According to Rigoni, Star Wars lifted and connected people. The longtime sci-fi fan also said, "It was a moment in time and a shared experience that happened in cities all across America. It caught everybody off guard, and something like that hasn't happened since." Even veteran broadcast journalist Walter Cronkite spoke highly of the film when he was interviewed for the documentary Empire of Dreams, the story of the Star Wars trilogy. Cronkite had this to say, George Lucas's Star Wars lifted us out of our depression of the 70s and into an awareness and focus on space and its possible future. This movie stood by itself. Lucas himself had a similar perspective on the film and why it was so successful.
It's been a long time since people have been able to go to the movies and see a sort of straightforward, wholesome, fun adventure.
Believe it or not, some people weren't that into Star Wars when they saw it on the big screen in 1977. While many veteran film critics such as Roger Ebert waxed lyrical about the film, some of his peers were definitely not impressed. Joy Gould Boyum wrote in the Wall Street Journal, "There's something depressing about seeing all these impressive cinematic gifts and all this extraordinary technological skill lavished on such puerile materials."
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
It's hard to understand now, but some viewers were so underwhelmed that they actually walked out of the film. Speaking to StarWars.com, Fan Denise Steele revealed that she watched the majority of the movie alone at a theater in small-town Mississippi after her friends decided to get up and leave. "We arrived a little late, as usual, just as R2 and 3PO were walking across the sands of Tatooine. About 15 minutes later, my friends declared the movie to be lame and walked out. I stayed by myself and fell in love with Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Princess Leia. I met with them again the following night and again the following weekend. Although it's tame by today's standards, for some younger viewers, Star Wars was actually a little too violent. In the UK, one young girl complained about the scene in which Alec Guinness's Obi-Wan Kenobi protects Luke and slices off Ponda Baba's arm with a swift stroke of his lightsaber.
It was exciting, but I didn't like the bit when the man chopped off the person's arm.
Why not?
Because there was blood.
It's hard to confuse a Jedi Master with a bounty hunter, but in 1980 the distinction wasn't as clear. Let's go back in time to see what it was like to watch The Empire Strikes Back when it was first released. While The Empire Strikes Back is the middle chapter of a trilogy, many fans initially felt it left too much to interpretation. In a letter to the science fiction film magazine Starlog, one fan named Sean Bernard wrote, "I know they wanted to leave something to settle in the other sequels, but they left a little too much. For instance, Han Solo's predicament. The movie should not have ended until Han was either killed by Boba Fett or Jabba, or rescued by Lando Calrissian or Chewbacca, the former preferably. Also, the fate of Bespin is not told. Was it taken by Lando's troops, taken by Imperial troops, or destroyed by Vader?" This criticism proved common enough that film star Harrison Ford responded to it. In an interview with Rolling Stone, Ford said, "One of series creator George Lucas's real strengths is not giving you all the information you need, yet at the same time, not denying you anything essential. You have a feeling that you want to know more at all times. I have heard frequently that there is a certain kind of disappointment with the ending of the second film. I've heard people say, 'There's no end to this film,' or 'I can't wait to find out what happens.' But they will, and that's exactly the effect intended by the ending."
I am your father.
This revelation from The Empire Strikes Back is often considered one of the most shocking moments in movie history. The twist was so surprising, in fact, that many fans in 1980 doubted what they'd just heard. Starlog reader Robert L. B.D. Scarola wrote, "Is Luke related to Vader? Most think so now that Vader came right out and said it. Well, I say, do you believe everything you hear? Vader may have lied just to enlist Luke to his side. Vader would then dispose of Luke once he got what he wanted. Even most of the cast and crew were kept in the dark. As Mark Hamill explained on The Graham Norton Show in 2017, the version they filmed had an alternate twist.
In that scene, the way we filmed it, Vader said, "You don't know the truth. Obi-Wan killed your father."
After filming the scene, Hamill said that the director, Irvin Kershner, pulled him aside and told him that Darth Vader is actually Luke's father. However, he was forbidden to tell anyone else, including his castmates. That meant that even Harrison Ford and Carrie Fisher didn't learn the real line until they finally saw a screening of the film.
At the screening, when that happened, Harrison turned to me and said, "Hey kid, you didn't tell me that."
Another line that left fans scratching their heads after the original screenings of The Empire Strikes Back was something Yoda said to Ben.
That boy is our last hope.
No, there is another.
One Starlog reader named Bill Smith theorized, could it be Vader himself? Considering that there was an equilibrium of power between the good and dark sides of the Force, it would not be impossible to turn Vader into the antithesis of what he is now, especially if Luke is truly his son. On the other hand, a fan named Keith Hoffman wrote, "I suggest Princess Leia. She is young enough for the training. She withstood Darth Vader's tortures. She is dedicated to the cause. Princess Leia, not Lando. heard Luke's cries for help. Han Solo is not in shape to be going anywhere for a while, and he is too old. I wouldn't be surprised if in the third film, Leia, instead of Luke, destroys the Emperor. As it turns out, each of them was a little bit right, although not in the ways they expected. Vader did switch sides at the end of Return of the Jedi, and Leia ultimately proved to be Force-sensitive as well. "I know" is often considered one of the most clever improvised lines in movie history, but not everyone felt that way in 1980. Starlog reader Jeanette Vogelpohl wrote, "Somebody should tell Harrison Ford that when a woman passionately tells a man, 'I love you,' 'I know' is not an acceptable response." That scene was not funny. It was infuriating. Another person who was not a fan of Ford's line was George Lucas. In a 2011 interview with Jon Favreau, the Han Solo actor shared how the Star Wars creator responded to his improvised line.
And George, I think that this is fair enough to say, he went ape. He thought it was horrible and that it would get a bad laugh.
However, despite his distaste for Ford's version of the scene, Lucas allowed the line to stay in for test screenings, where it was received favorably by audiences. Given how iconic that line is today, it seems like Lucas made the right call to let it remain in the film. While The Empire Strikes Back wasn't universally beloved upon its release, plenty of fans recognized it as a masterpiece as soon as they saw it. One positive reaction came from Starlog reader David K. Abernathy, who wrote, "After seeing The Empire Strikes Back, I came away with the feeling that finally, after all these years, science fiction has been brought to the screen in all its glory. The Empire Strikes Back is so rich, so full of mystery and excitement, and most of all, wonder. To me, The Empire Strikes Back represents the first true science fiction film, with all of its parts complete. The characters, the theme, the special effects, and the magic. It has the right to be called the first science fiction epic." Another Starlog reader, Arlene Berenberg, wrote, "I didn't think they could do it, but they did. They made a movie that was better than the first Star Wars. More action, more dimension to the characters, more and better effects, everything that made Star Wars so great the first time, plus much more. The Force was certainly with George Lucas when he created this fabulous sequel." David Gerrold, a science fiction author and Star Trek television writer, reviewed The Empire Strikes Back for Starlog number 38, but was not very kind to the film. In his review, he wrote, "Just about every other critic in the country has been telling you how good the picture is. They've been falling over themselves to tell you. It's embarrassing. I feel guilty for not liking it as much as I'm supposed to." Considering that Star Trek relies more on grounded science than Star Wars, Gerrold's criticisms of The Empire Strikes Back were mostly about how it disregarded real-world logistics. He was frustrated by the many ways in which its plot and characters seemed to ignore the physics of the world they were in.
Now let's go through this shower of asteroids, who cares? And my hair won't get messed up.
Gerrold justified his criticism by reasoning that the film was using science fiction devices, even if its plot skewed closer to fantasy. He also criticized Luke's growth, but enjoyed other parts of the movie, including the musical score, performances, production design, and effects. Many Starlog readers were unimpressed with Gerrold's review. They struck back hard in issue number 40, where a reader named Michael Mallory wrote, "Mr. Gerrold complains about what he deems storytelling flaws in logic or science in The Empire Strikes Back. As for the scientific misrepresentations, I can only say they don't matter. This is a fantasy movie. I'm tired of people faulting these films for not being intellectual enough. Who said they were supposed to be thought-provoking? Few films are perfect. Nitpicking is like criticizing an apple for not being steak when you're hungry for steak. It might be the best apple you ever tasted, but it's still lousy steak." Some letters to Gerrold were nicer, but overall, they weren't the biggest fans of Starlog's official review. Like Gerrold, professional critics were also initially mixed on The Empire Strikes Back, and some of them were downright savage about it. Washington Post critic Judith Martin wrote, "The Empire Strikes Back has no plot structure, no character studies, let alone character development, no emotional or philosophical point to make. It has no original vision of the future, which is depicted as a pastiche of other junk culture formulae, such as the Western, the costume epic, and the World War II movie. Its specialty is special effects or visual tricks, some of which are playful, imaginative, and impressive, but others of which have become space movie cliches." Frederick S. Clark of Cinefantastique magazine was also not a fan. Making a prediction that really didn't age well, Clark wrote, "The Empire Strikes Back is a lifeless copy of Star Wars, propelled chiefly on the momentum of that earlier film. Without the likes of a Peter Cushing or Alec Guinness to add some dignity and solid support, Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, and Harrison Ford flounder in roles that are certain to doom their careers, regardless of the series' success." However, as with the fans, there were some critics who loved The Empire Strikes Back right out of the gate. The legendary Gene Siskel of the Chicago Tribune gave the film 3.5 out of 4 stars, saying his only issues with it were trivial compared to the strengths of the film, which are considerable and sometimes even majestic. The Empire Strikes Back was the cinematic introduction of 2 characters who would go on to be immortalized in merchandise for decades to come, Yoda and Boba Fett. However, Arthur Knight, a critic for The Hollywood Reporter, confused them in his review of the film. Knight's column started out smoothly, praising The Empire Strikes Back as the best science fiction movie since Star Wars. He also said that Kershner's direction made the characters come alive even more than in the previous film. However, 2 paragraphs in, Knight wrote, "As to the present episode, despite a couple of phoned-in messages from Ben Kenobi, which, collected, must last all of 40 seconds, most of Luke Skywalker's good advice comes from a fascinating green-hued character named Boba Fett, and I'm still not certain whether he's a skillfully animated puppet or a real-live human being. Whichever, he's one of Lucas's strongest assets in this Star Wars incarnation." Today, the archived version of the review begins with an update correcting the error, but it serves as an amusing reminder that the icons of the present were once still new and novel to fans. However, even if he mixed up their names, Knight was correct in his assumption that both Boba Fett and Yoda would go on to count themselves among Lucas's strongest and most marketable assets. If some of the pushback against The Empire Strikes Back feels strangely familiar, even if you weren't around in 1980, there's a reason for that. The initial response to The Empire Strikes Back is eerily similar to that of 2017's Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Both middle chapters of their respective trilogies tried to take the Star Wars franchise in exciting new directions, and both received mixed reviews from fans who were initially displeased with the wide gap between their expectations and the film itself. Thanks to the internet and social media, the backlash against The Last Jedi was much louder, but the parallels are still unmistakable. Many fans slammed The Last Jedi for its diversity and assumed political correctness, in addition to critiquing the coherence of its plot. Of course, few fans in 1980 were complaining about The Empire Strikes Back being too politically correct, but there were similar complaints about the story not being coherent or compelling. Mike Ryan of Uproxx mentioned in a 2019 interview with The Last Jedi writer and director Rian Johnson that The Empire Strikes Back also divided fans when it was first released. The filmmaker admitted that even he himself was initially disappointed with Empire, which was actually the first Star Wars movie he remembered seeing. However, he eventually came to his senses, saying that after watching and loving Return of the Jedi, he wound up warming to Empire. In fact, although he was initially a fan of The Empire Strikes Back, it gradually became his favorite of the trilogy. So perhaps if The Last Jedi follows in the footsteps of its predecessor, it may someday be looked upon as fondly as The Empire Strikes Back.
A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, Return of the Jedi had yet to be released. What did people think was going to happen? What was spoiler culture like? And how did critics describe Jabba the Hutt to people who hadn't seen him yet? Here's what it was really like to see Return of the Jedi in 1983. Some movie series open to mediocre reception and find their legacy years later as cult classics, but that was not the case with Star Wars. The first 2 films had become cultural phenomenons, and audiences eagerly awaited Return of the Jedi, the final installment to the original trilogy. Think back to the excitement in the air on the opening night of Spider-Man No Way Home, another threequel, or even The Rise of Skywalker, the third of the Star Wars sequel trilogy films. This isn't a new thing. Audiences in 1983 did the same thing we do in 2022, totally geek out at the movies.
Pew, pew, pew.
Long before electronic seat reservations were standard or even fathomable, fans in Los Angeles waited outside their theater for days prior to the midnight debut of Return of the Jedi on May 25, 1983. And by days, we mean days.
We've been here for 6 days and it's great!
And why wouldn't they? After all, the previous film, The Empire Strikes Back, had left everyone with the cliffhanger that Darth Vader was Luke's father. What could possibly follow that revelation? In 1983, the Denver Post claimed that Return of the Jedi was, quote, one of the most anticipated movies of all time, sharing a photo of moviegoers waiting outside in costume as their favorite characters. Adoration for this galaxy far, far away has truly been bringing people together for generations. One of the most satisfying things about being a devoted fan of something, whether it be a show or a book series or, in this case, Star Wars, is being in on all the inside jokes and lesser-known deets. These days, the sheer amount of stuff to geek out on is endless, but back in 1983, possessing deep knowledge about any given pop culture phenomenon was a little more novel of an experience. That being said, if you were there on opening night of Return of the Jedi, you would have seen numerous in-the-know fans wearing shirts bearing the original title of the trilogy's epic conclusion. Yep, you heard us right. As it turns out, Return of the Jedi was originally titled Revenge of the Jedi.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I break your concentration?
And this wasn't just an internal temporary name that was changed before announcing the movie to the public either. It made it so far in the post-production process that the first trailer for the movie advertised Revenge of the Jedi to prospective audiences. Eventually, Revenge was swapped for Return, and the rest is, of course, movie history. A good idea never really goes away, though, because in 2005, the removed word would finally make its way into a Star Wars movie with the release of Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith.
Good.
We've all been there. You innocently log into Twitter around 8 a.m. and start scrolling, only to find that some guy just had to be the first one to drop spoilers about the new episode of The Mandalorian that dropped in the middle of the night.
What else did he say?
Or maybe a headline unashamedly gives away the end credits scene of Eternals. You get mad when someone spoils a movie or television show before you've gotten a chance to see it? Dodging spoilers is an art, but it's not a new practice. While 1983 audiences may not have been avoiding tweets, they had means of their own to be wary of when Return of the Jedi debuted. In footage from a 1983 newscast recorded seemingly on opening night, an audience member spills that Darth Vader shows his face to Luke.
The big surprise was seeing Darth Vader unveil himself to his son. It was very exciting.
In the series until this point, Darth Vader had very much been masked and cloaked, with no intention or even mention of ever taking off his signature attire. News that he appears in Return of the Jedi in some sort of visually revealing way would have been a major spoiler. Elsewhere in the same set of interviews, another audience member reveals that the movie ends in celebration. While this perhaps could have been predicted by those who knew the movie was a finale to a trilogy, even a happy ending wasn't necessarily guaranteed, and still would have at least been a minor spoiler. Watch out, viewers of the nightly news. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the extreme popularity for all things Star Wars from the series' inception in 1977, Return of the Jedi did wonders at the box office and made history. The New York Times excitedly broke the news a few days later that the movie's opening day, May 25, 1983, earned $6.2 million, the biggest opening day in movie history at that time. It beat the previous record held by 1982's Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. Despite the phenomenon that Star Wars clearly was, the Times noted the success of Return of the Jedi was furthermore impressive because its release day was a Wednesday rather than the traditional Friday opening. Even on a weeknight, nothing was going to keep audiences away from seeing what happened next for Luke Skywalker or Han Solo.
Over my dead body.
In keeping with tradition, future Star Wars films would achieve the same feat. When perusing Box Office Mojo's list of biggest opening day box offices, we can see other movies in the series after Return of the Jedi broke opening day records at the time of their respective releases, including 1999's The Phantom Menace, 2005's Revenge of the Sith, and 2015's The Force Awakens. It can be difficult to please everyone when it comes to sequels, especially if it's the last entry in a series. This is especially evident when considering the contradictory opinions from critics upon the release of Return of the Jedi. For instance, The Hollywood Reporter lamented, "To be sure, the film abounds in action. Some new peril besets Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, or Princess Leia almost too regularly every 10 minutes. But there's a kind of desperation about it, a feeling that Lucas and co-writer Lawrence Kasdan are simply trying to figure out what they can do next to amuse the kiddies." By contrast, the Washington Post couldn't sing the film's praises enough, saying, "Return of the Jedi, a feat of mass enchantment, puts the happy finishing touches on George Lucas's Star Wars saga. It was worth the wait, and the work is now an imposing landmark in contemporary popular culture. It's all water under the bridge now, of course, but it's nonetheless fascinating to wonder how these differing perspectives affected the expectations of those who had yet to see the trilogy's conclusion in the theaters for the very first time." Outside of broad opinions of the film, it's also interesting to take into account how critics were faced with teasing details from Return of the Jedi without saying too much. How does one describe Jabba the Hutt to someone who hasn't seen the movie yet? Critic Roger Ebert summed up the infamous intergalactic crime lord as such: "Jabba is a slimy, gruesome reptilian monster made of warts and teeth, a cross between a toad and the Cheshire Cat." Looking back from our current perspective, we'd say that's quite a visceral description that still leaves a lot to the imagination. The British Film Institute's description poetically plays off of Ebert's, labeling Jabba as, quote, "imposingly repellent and a toad inflated to nightmarish complacency." On the other hand, The Hollywood Reporter kept things relatively vague, describing Jabba as, quote, "truly frightening and gross." Regardless of which review fans happen to stumble upon in the lead-up to their initial viewing experience, it goes without saying that no collection of words can quite do Jabba justice. You just have to see the sadistic, oversized slug for yourself. In 1983, Jabba the Hutt and the denizens of his secluded desert palace weren't the only cosmic creatures on moviegoers' minds. Just 1 year prior, Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extraterrestrial had become a huge hit.
E.T. Home phone.
While E.T. and Return of the Jedi are quite different, audiences might have felt a similar euphoria while viewing both movies. Starlog magazine highlighted reader reviews shortly after Jedi debuted. Brian Richards from Minnesota wrote to the publication, "This is the first film since I saw E.T. that made me feel real good inside. I left the theater with my spirits soaring. Return of the Jedi is destined to become a classic." Other readers were not so enthused by the trilogy's conclusion, and mockingly compared it to, shall we say, less serious monuments of pop culture. Frank Gerard from New Jersey wrote, "Return of the Jedi was an overwhelming disappointment. I simply cannot believe George Lucas has given to eager Star Wars fans everywhere a film which belongs on The Muppet Show or Saturday morning TV. In the end, though, most fans were simply blown away." Barb Trimble from Mississippi gushed, "This movie is a non-stop ride on that Star Wars roller coaster. You barely have time to settle back in your seats after a white knuckler of a scene, then it's off again for round 2. Bravo, George." While it's true that Return of the Jedi was the final movie in the original Star Wars trilogy, there was plenty more yet to come, and audiences knew this. Even in 1983, it was public knowledge that George Lucas intended to make 9 Star Wars movies, and that Return of the Jedi was placed as 6th in the story. Quite the ambitious undertaking to reveal to the general public. Nonetheless, it would be 16 years before the story expanded when 1999's The Phantom Menace kicked off the prequel trilogy.
There's always a bigger fish.
While 1983 moviegoers might have known more Star Wars was on the way, they didn't expect Luke, Leia, or Han Solo to ever re-enter the narrative, thanks to Roger Ebert's 1983 review. He said, "If George Lucas persists in his plan to make 9 Star Wars movies, this will nevertheless be the last we'll see of Luke, Han, and Leia, although the robots will be present in all the films." The droids would indeed continue to make appearances, but so would the 3 original leads, even if it took a bit longer for them to return to the series. Return of the Jedi was more than just a movie to some of its viewers. Inspired by its characters, story, and filmmaking technique, some audience members in 1983 left the theater feeling inspired to make movies of their own. This included Brad Bird, who at the time was 25 years old and working as an animator at Disney. In the foreword of the 2013 edition of the book The Making of Return of the Jedi, Bird shares that he snuck into a Lucasfilm crew screening of Return of the Jedi and marveled at seeing the film in the same room as George Lucas and director Richard Marquand. Bird writes, "I was now surrounded by the very geniuses who had brought this rarest of cinematic sagas to a satisfying conclusion in grand style." However, Bird wasn't wild about everything in the movie, specifically feeling like Luke's character had made an unrealistic leap from the hero in training he was at the end of The Empire Strikes Back to the confident protagonist he suddenly appeared to be by the beginning of Return of the Jedi. Bird reflects, "The point is not that I or any other fan agree with every single choice George has made in telling his epic saga. The point is that we care." There are, shall we say, polarizing creative choices within the Star Wars universe that fans have different perspectives on. While today, it's easy to look back on films that are considered classics and assume that nothing was controversial at the time of their release. Return of the Jedi actually put fans at odds when it came to a new creature the film introduced, Ewoks.
Point that thing someplace else.
The cuddly bear-like animals on the moon of Endor turned out to be quite the soldiers when faced with threats. In 1983, audiences were divided on what they thought of Ewoks and how they welcomed them, or didn't, into the series. Some audience members criticized the Ewoks as being nothing but a marketing device to sell toys. The subject, it seems, was something of a hot topic among fans in the 80s. Good thing we've moved on past those kinds of petty squabbles about things that we claim ruined Star Wars, right? Just kidding. Ewoks are definitely still a divisive subject to this day. Love them or hate them, though, the Ewoks went on to star in their own made-for-TV movies and animated TV series. And none of it would have happened without Return of the Jedi.